Let me start with a little bit of geography, not history. What we're going to talk about tonight are two sets of wars, one military and one much later environmental. They didn't really overlap, they were sequential, but the important thing to understand here is that you see the eastern coastal ridge along this side of the state, and then along here is a little geological formation called the Shanalegi Ledge. It's only about 3 to 5 feet, but it does separate the water from the central Everglades, which is here, it goes down in Florida Bay, this area here. The important thing is that these are cypress trees and the cross-hatching. This is grass up here, and these tend to be pine flatwoods up in the north. So this is important as we move through our discussion tonight, particularly as we get into the Seminole Wars, which were fought down below Lake Okeechobee and the Colusa River right here. So sort of bear this in mind, that this is the area we're talking about. This is the western Everglades geologically, and this is the year BC 2000. By this time, most of the settlements were out here along the coast. Because of the glaciers melting, the sea level moved in gradually, but there's very little archaeological evidence out here until somewhat later. The first evidence actually is right here, and this is a glades culture which existed in southwest Florida. It remained distinct from the Colusa area, and we know that there was a certain amount of trade going on by the fact that these pots that you see, the little sherds, tended to be over in Miami and in Key Largo area, but they came over here, which indicated that there was a generally trading agreement of some sort, and there was cooperation among the tribes. By AD 900, the Colusa became expansive and started to become hegemonous around 750, but their expansion was basically eastward along the Colusa River and up toward Fort Center, which we'll look at in a moment, up by Lake Okeechobee. The Colusa were expansive northward, and there's artifactual evidence that there were possible fortifications near Lake Okeechobee. So my point here is that whereas the Glades people, separate from the Colusa area in the 10,000 islands, were generally cooperative because there was plenty to eat, there were plenty of resources, and there was no need to have any sort of sense of conflict. This is an area at Fort Center, which is just northwest of Lake Okeechobee, and this is a picture of something called Tony's Mound. And in the period of 1000 to about 1400, there were some characteristics of this that archaeologists thought were defensive. It looks a little bit like fortification, but then they decided that that probably was not the case, and it was more agricultural than anything else. However, it's possible that this other fortifications of this design might have been provoked by the Colusa because there is a great deal of Colusa designed pottery in this area. And recent archaeology has shown that Tony's Mound was probably more an agricultural operation, and the areas that you see here were not defensive fortifications, but were actually irrigation fortifications and irrigation areas where the fields were growing various crops were out here. Nonetheless, the Colusa were on the move. They were highly organized, and they were highly militaristic. This is the gorget that was found up at Pine Island, and it talks about, in pictures, a number of things that tell us about the hegemonous Colusa. They had 3 classes of people. They were basically chieftain classes, and then there were warrior classes, and then the commoners. The warrior classes probably were inbred. They were tall, and they were strong. They were 6'2", 6'3", which is remarkable for many Native Americans. So the sense is that in order to accomplish this, there had to be a great deal of inbreeding among the warrior class. Secondly, you can see there's the expansion of ritual behavior and very complex religious beliefs. They believed that the human being had 3 souls, one which never died. And the ethnography from Spanish explorers indicates that there also was the possibility of prehistoric cannibalism in Southwest Florida. And finally, there was clearly slavery and human sacrifice among the Colusa. So now all of a sudden, instead of a cooperative society, we have a hegemonous society that has moved down into Southwest Florida and basically is covering the entire coast. A little bit more interesting is symbolism that exists from findings at Key Marco and up at Pine Island. What was found was a head right up here. And as you can see, there are multiple uses. There could be a statuary use, there could be a headdress, and then it could be articulation of the jaw. A number of pieces found at Key Marco had this same. There was a wolf at Key Marco that had an articulated jaw as well. So the sense was that these people had complex rituals in order to do that. In addition to that, they also, as you can see in this slide, which is feather and motif of epaulets in the headdress. There's a gorget, which is this little item here, which was a famous sort of symbol of leadership. The important thing is that with the epaulets and the headdress, this warrior, who was already 6'2" or 6'3", appears to be even much, much bigger. Mound Key was the headquarters of the Colusa. If you go to Mound Key today, you'll see the remnants of a central canal. And the likelihood is that when the Spanish first came over, and we'll look at that in a minute, that they were required to anchor their boats out and come in smaller barks. They would have to come up the canal in order to meet with the chieftains of the Colusa tribe, and along the sides of these large banks were these warriors who were dressed as you see here. It had to be an imposing and impressive sight. The first contact took place in June of 1513. It was Ponce de Leon who came to Charlotte Harbor. What he thought was a possible treasure trove, because he'd been in South America and some of the other conquistadors had been down there as well. He found very little, and he returned in 1521. This is a picture from the Florida State Museum, but it is incredibly inaccurate because look at the height of these two. The fact is, De Leon was only 5'2". Chief Colusa was about 6'2" to 6'3". Second error is the Spanish didn't bring gold, they were looking for gold. That was their hope. So, although it's a lovely little picture at the Florida State Museum of the 1521 meeting, it is incredibly inaccurate. The truth is that what happened, that De Leon was hit by a Colusa arrow in the thigh, and he returned to Cuba, where he eventually died. That chilled any further exploration of the Spanish into Southwest Florida for over 35 years. And the only European presence was priests who were sent to catechize the natives. They had some success. One of the Colusa chieftains actually converted to Christianity, and because of that, the Spanish were then encouraged to come back to Southwest Florida. And this is a picture of Carlos, who is the chieftain of the Colusa, meeting Pedro Mendez de Ayala, and he was named governor of the state of Florida by the Spanish in 1565, and he decided to come back to Southwest Florida in 1566. As you can see, this is a somewhat more accurate picture because of the size, relatively, of Carlos the chieftain. This is his war chief over here, his family, and this is Ponce de Leon, who is much, much shorter, and this is a much more accurate presentation of probably what took place. Menendez wanted peace. Carlos was willing to offer him peace in the form of his sister, who Mendez married. You thought, well, that's an easy thing to have done. It really wasn't the idea that Menendez had in mind, because he believed he could take Carlos's sister as hostage, and that would ensure that the Colusa would behave suitably in the future. She escaped, and uneasy truce lasted for many, many years. Further efforts by the fathers and the friars met with failure. All the missions that were established in Southwest Florida were closed. The Jesuits lost 9 priests and decided to leave the Colusa alone until the 18th century. But as we all know, what really happened was the vectors of disease, diphtheria, smallpox, and measles, decimated the population of the entire native population of the United States. 80 to 90% of Native Americans died of those 3 diseases that it brought from the Anglo-Europeans. So finally, what happened was Spain ceded Florida to Britain in 1763, and the Colusa at about that time went to Cuba. But a few of them remained, and those few were no longer coastal residents, but they went inland to the Big Cypress and the Fakahatchee and became part of the Seminole tribes. This is Shell Island Road, where the Conservancy used to have a nature center, the Breeze Nature Center. What you see here is now the base of most of the roads in southern Collier County. They used the shell mounds of the Colusa Indians and the Glades culture for road beds. If you want to look at this, exactly where this is right now, there it is. And if you go down to the end of Shell Island Road and you look carefully along the edge here, you will see this entire large pond is edged with shells, part of that shell mound that was once a Colusa and Glades culture artifact. So now we come to the Seminoles. The Seminole Wars, there were 3 of them, 1816 to 1858. This particular picture is interesting because it's from the Second Seminole War, when they actually sent Marines into the Big Cypress in Southwest Florida because the area was so impenetrable. If you look carefully here, you see 2 Seminoles hiding in the mangrove roots. If you look very carefully at this guy, he looks very much like a primate and not necessarily a human being. But that was sort of the way that the Americans at that time regarded the Seminoles. In 1816, Andrew Jackson came down to Southwest Florida. He was based in St. Augustine, came down to Tampa, made 1 excursion into Southwest Florida, took a look at it, went right back to Tampa. Jackson became president, and in the Second Seminole War, decided that, and this is a direct quote, that God wanted the white people to till the Georgia soil. What had been happening since the early 1800s was slaves were escaping from the South, from Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Georgia, and joining with Seminoles. They were called Black Seminoles. And Jackson decided that this was something that had to stop. There were tribes in the northern part of the Flint state, and in Georgia, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and some of those, but they were not involved in the Seminole Wars. They were eventually and quickly relocated down to Oklahoma. So, the first war, 1816, 1819. When Jackson came down, the Spanish decided that he had invaded their territory, but finally gave up. They felt that they could not defend Southwest Florida from Cuba, and they ceded the state over to the United States. Lastly, the U.S. began to build forts, and those forts became an important part of what happened in the Second Seminole War. These were battles fought mainly in Central and North Florida. The headquarters were St. Augustine and Tampa, and somewhat down the coast. The forts were, of course, Fort Myers, Fort Pierce. If you can, so up and down, you can find some of the remnants of the old forts. The reason that there was little battle down here was, once again, you see the natives, because of the guerrilla tactics they used, and the Army was employing the standard tactics of infantry on artillery. The important thing to remember about this is that the only access to the Big Cypress and the Fakahatchee in Southwest Florida was by the coast. The United States troops had to come down by boat, except in 1841 during the Second Seminole War. For the first time in history, a cadre of United States troops crossed the Everglades by canoe. Their attempt was to come into the back door of the Big Cypress where the Seminoles were hiding. They never found them, and they went out to the coast, back up to Fort Myers, and then up to Tampa. President Jackson was tired of the natives harassing settlers, accepting slaves. There were 6 generals who fought in the Second Seminole War. Zachary Taylor was one, Martin Van Buren was another, and of course Jackson. Winfield Scott is pictured here. Scott was heavily heralded as the hero of the War of 1812. And his idea was to adopt a scorched earth policy in the Second War. By doing that, Scott's troops invaded all the Seminole villages from the Colusa south, and at that point, they wiped out the children, wiped out the families. And it resulted in a massive removal to Oklahoma. Seminoles finally had to give up. Scott was an interesting guy. He was based in St. Augustine, came and then moved his base to Tampa to be able to work on these operations down from Colusa south. And he loved wine and he loved music. So he brought casks of wine with him. And he brought bands with him, not military bands, but dancing bands, so they could play music while he was in his headquarters in Tampa, Florida, conducting scorched earth policy throughout Southwest Florida. The war was unpopular with most people, particularly in New England. So this is the document in the Florida State Museum about the whites who were being massacred by the Indians and the blacks in Florida. The reproduction is not very good, and I couldn't make it much better. But this quote at the top is a Seminole chieftain named Halleck, who was south of the Colusa in the Big Cypress, and he claimed that he was hunted like a wolf, and now, once the Seminole War was over and removed to Oklahoma, he would be sent away like a dog. The Third Seminole War was a short one. Obviously, having the scorched earth policy being successful as it was, there was very little resistance, but there was this guy right here named Coahuila. He was known as the Wildcat. He was a great tactician. He spoke multiple languages, and he used the Big Cypress as a safe haven. He was dressed as Hamlet and his chief aide as Richard III when he was captured, believe it or not, in 1841. He was in Fort Pierce, and he was taken to Tampa. From Tampa, he escaped and came back down here. And finally, the war ended with the Indian removal to Oklahoma of all the remaining Indians except about 150 Seminoles who were left in South Florida. So, about 150 years later, here we are. This is 1933, a Seminole village. And in 1962, the Miccosukes, who were part of the Seminole tribe, won recognition for their tribal identity related heavily to the idea of gambling and casinos. That's sort of the end of the military operations and the military wars in South Florida. Let's switch now to the environmental wars. The snowy egret was the main target of the plume hunters. They became the rage in England in the 1870s and spread worldwide, particularly in the United States. In 1886, as you can see, there were over 5 million plume birds shot in Florida. And that same year, the value of a plume was $20 an ounce, which exceeded the price of gold at the time. It was that valuable. And as a result, by 1900, nearly 95% of the wading bird population of South Florida had been totally shot out. You may remember the story of Guy Bradley. There's a book called Death in the Everglades, which is a great story about him, hired as the first Audubon warden to prevent plume hunting. He was killed in the Everglades. Guy Bradley was actually a guide at the age of 15 for Jacques Chevalier, who was one of the famous French plume hunters when the Europeans decided that they liked plumes for their hats. Bradley became the guide, and then after he had seen one season's work by Chevalier, he decided that was no longer what he wanted to do and volunteered to become the Audubon warden, which eventually led to his death. This is a picture of the nesting great egret. The snowy was one of their favorites, but this was also a target because during the mating season and early nesting season, the plumage was at its best. And that was when the birds would be shot for the hats, because that was when the plumage really was at its finest. And the answer, this is not a good slide, and I apologize for it, is sanctuaries. 95% of the wading bird population was wiped out, but the sanctuaries created a safe haven for nesting, and eventually many of the populations have come back. As Rob said earlier, the current wading bird population is back on a downturn, on a decline, but it's certainly much better than it was in 1901 when the federal government passed an act that banned plume hunting from the United States. So now let's move to a little geography. This is the Big Cypress and the Fakahatchee Strand. As you can see, it's a map from my book. And over here is Southern Golden Gate Estates. So we're going to talk about this whole area here and some of the things that happened after the plume hunters went away. The first thing that happened was logging in the Western Everglades. The Fakahatchee was purchased in 1913 by the Lee Tidewater Company, and a Collier Company leased land which it owned in the Big Cypress. What you see here is a workstation building a tram where you can see the ties and the rails coming in. The important thing is the amount of destruction that you see on the trams right now, which are part of the trails in the Fakahatchee. Those trams were built throughout, beginning in 1944 as a wartime measure, and logging began about the same time. It was limited to the smaller strands because that was where the cypress grew, not so much in the upper levels. It was always in the strands. And in 10 years, the Fakahatchee was totally denuded of cypress trees. They used small engines to haul the logs, which they had sawn from the strands, back to the main line at Copeland. The important thing about this picture is to look at the destruction that is caused in building the rails and in getting the logs in and out to the small trains. This is a picture of the Lee Tidewater Cypress 262. It was one of 4 engines that they used throughout the Big Cypress and the Fakahatchee. They were lumbering 1 million board feet per week in the Western Everglades. So you can see in the 10 years how frenetic this activity was. When the Collier Company moved, we don't know how many board feet were actually taken out of the Western Everglades because the records are no longer available. But we do know that it was a highly desirable wood. It's resistant to insects, resistant to rot, and was useful almost immediately. Did not have to be treated with chemicals as some of the later woods were. This is a picture of a cypress that is probably between 125 and 150 years old. The diameter of this, according to the Collier County Museum, was 15 feet. That's an enormous tree. And the question is, how in the world could you get that out of there? Well, here's how they did it. The first thing they did, they girdled the trees with an axe to dry them out before harvesting. And they cut them around and they would dry them out, and that would lighten the tree itself. Then they had to cut through the heavy underbrush, of course, to get to the trees and get them out. It was brutally hard work, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. That was the standard work schedule of the workers. And then they had skidders that tied to stumps that took the felled trees to the tram to load them onto flat cars. Every tree was cut to 32 feet. That happened to fit onto the flat cars. And the skidders would be tied to a tree stump, and they would ratchet it to about 15 meters, about 15 yards or so. Then they would tie it to another tree stump and do the same thing and ratchet this thing back toward the tracks where they would load it onto the flat cars and onto the trams. So in 1966, having logged out this whole area, it was sold to a company called General American. General American developed Southern Golden Gate Estates. And you can see right here that this is the Fakahatchee Strand State Preserve where the logging took place. Panther Refuge up here, the big cypress is over here. And this is basically the end of what was the Western Everglades. And the big cypress area that you saw up here is the Piney Flatwoods we looked at in the first slide. This was an enterprise undertaken by the Rosen Brothers from Baltimore. They bought 70,000 acres north of Alligator Alley and 42,000 acres to the south. They also owned Cape Coral, which they developed first. And when they sold Southern Golden Gate Estates and the northern estates, they used pictures of Cape Coral to show what this area might look like in the future. They doubled down by buying 28,000 acres in the Fakahatchee. Because the Fakahatchee was an old strand, been heavily logged, it wasn't suitable for development. They didn't try to drain it with canals or roads, they used it for hunting camps. So when you bought land in Golden Gate Estates, you also sometimes could have your own hunting camp in the Fakahatchee. But they ran into trouble. By 1973, their deceptive sale practices had them in trouble with the Federal Trade Commission, and they had filed bankruptcy one time, but this time they filed bankruptcy a second time and became GAC Corporation and built itself up to the fourth highest market cap of any company in the state of Florida. Eventually, because of the problems they had in Cape Coral with culling and cutting mangroves, they ended up giving 9,000 acres of their Fakahatchee land to the state as the state began to develop the Fakahatchee, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So how did they do all this? Well, they wined and dined. There's 173 square miles in Golden Gate Estates, 813 miles of badly maintained roads, 183 miles of canals, and there were between 30 and 40,000 individual owners of property in northern and southern Golden Gate Estates. But there was no electricity, and the southern area flooded during the summer. So the way they did it was they brought people down from the north, put them up in Fort Myers, flew them down here, let them see Cape Coral in the wintertime during the dry season, and then they took them back, wine and dine, and they had dinner, and they had a bell, a gong, at the front of the room. And they say, bong, lot 255 is gone. Who wants next one? Bong, lot 1255, the lots are going, you better get in fast. And by this time, the frenzy would develop, and they would sell the properties. People who came down to look for the properties couldn't find them, because in many cases they were underwater. Eventually, because of the lack of development in the southern Golden Gate Estates, this became a fire hazard, and Collier County decided that this was time to do something about it. And that was the beginning of the development of what's now the Picayune Strand. It became a landing spot for South American drug dealers because the roads were unoccupied and there was very little law enforcement. They would fly light planes in, they would dump the drugs off, take right back off again and fly out and fly under the radar. You all may remember those radar balloons that used to be in South Florida. They could get under those with light planes. And this is where they landed, in the southern Golden Gate Estates. They drained the land. This is a picture of a canal, and I'll show you almost the same canal in the next picture. And this is what the land looked like. Unfortunately, what was happening though, by draining all of the estates, 112,000 acres, the 10,000 islands in Rookery Bay were starting to suffer heavily by influxes of fresh water rather than water percolating and settling gradually and then oozing its way down into the 10,000 islands, the way nature intended it to. So what happened was, this is an epic tale of success. The Conservancy petitioned in 1996 to add the Southern Golden Gate Estates to the Big Cypress Area of Critical State Concern. This is an important designation because it rises above the level of developable land and puts it in a wholly separate category. The Conservancy then agreed to provide manpower to do the buyouts. Of the 30 to 40,000 individual homeowners worldwide, the Conservancy volunteers undertook to do this. And from 1986 to 2005, Conservancy volunteers worked on this, and eventually, with Jesse Hardy, the last holdout, selling his land, the Picayune was ready to restore. So the Corps of Engineers is now plugging the canals, and the Conservancy is doing a great deal of work on restoration data. The important thing to note about this is what they're doing is having control elevations at each of these plugs, which eventually makes the water flood out and work its way onto both sides of the canal, and then it'll percolate and settle the way it used to. By using control elevations, there will be gradual movement toward the 10,000 islands and toward Rookery Bay. And in case of epic flooding, instead of epic success, there are pumps that are in the area of north of 75 that will drain the water faster out of the northern Golden Gate, where there are populations up in the piney flat woods that is now developed up there. In 1968, a jetport was going to be built. The Dade County Port Authority and Collier County agreed to condemn 39 square miles of the Big Cypress. This was Collier land. And the site was dedicated and ground was broken in 1968 for a jetport. But the Miami-Dade County Commission had a commissioner named Robert Patrick, who said, I think there should be an environmental analysis for the hydrology of what this is going to do to the Big Cypress and to eventually all of the Western Everglades flowing down to the 10,000 islands. The Everglades Coalition was formed then in 1968 to fight the Big Cypress Jetport. And with Nathaniel Reed and a friend of mine named Joe Browder, who was an Audubon in Washington, they got the battle moved to Washington, D.C. They brought Walter Hickel, who was the Secretary of the Interior here. President Nixon decided that he would take a look at it. In 1969, here's what it looked like, what Walter Hickel saw. This is just the beginning of the Big Cypress Jetport. But the environmental impact study got done. And the author was Luna Leopold, who was Aldo Leopold's son. This is a remarkable 72-page document that described exactly what would happen to the water in the Big Cypress if the jetport was built. Governor Kirk had agreed early with the Miami-Dade Port Authority to let the airport be built. So this report then gave him political cover, and his assistant Nathaniel Reed told him how to do it, so he could back off. And at that point, the Jetport Pact of 1970, agreed to interior transportation in the state of Florida, was completed. There were 83,000 acres of Collier land at this point that were swapped to have the Big Cypress Act of 1973 passed and land beginning to be donated. The reason the Colliers gave it up was they wanted some land in Phoenix, Arizona, near an airport. And they felt that the swap of 12,000 acres in Arizona for 83,000 wet acres in the Big Cypress was a good deal, and that was the beginning of the Big Cypress as we know it today. So was that really the picture that we saw back there of the Boeing 727 what it was all about? No, it was about this. The Miami-Dade Port Authority knew that in 1962 a consortium had begun trying to build a supersonic jet transport. And their feeling was that the supersonic transport was the way of the future. They didn't want this kind of airplane coming in too close to the city of Miami, and this is why they really decided to build the Jetport. As you know, the SST was operational in 1976 and went on for a while, but now that's no longer a viable transportation technology. But that was the real story as to why the Miami-Dade Port Authority decided to build that airport into Big Cypress. Sunnyland number one. Baron Collier said, "I can smell oil," and he knew that somewhere in this large county that he had bought from Lee County, there was oil. The first lease was signed with the Collier Company, Gulf Oil, in the 1930s. They dug 5 dry holes and decided to leave. The state of Florida was so convinced that oil was available in the Big Cypress or the Fakahatchee area that they offered $50,000 to anyone who could find it. And then in September of 1943, Humboldt Oil brought in a well, drilling down to 11,626 feet. And that's the well you see in this photograph from the Collier Museum. That's Sunnyland number one. It began producing at 425 barrels a day. People thought that was a good deal, and settled down to 20 barrels a day. So this well is the Collier-Hogan well, the famous well that got shut down. But I'd like to just give you some statistics about oil in the Big Cypress. And this is important because this is an issue that's coming up in the legislative session going on right now. First, by 1954, Sunnyland was producing 1,370 barrels a day, and that is in multiple wells. That's not number one, but that's in multiple wells, compared to the United States production, total production of 240,000 barrels per day. So it's a minuscule amount. Secondly, by the early 1960s, the producers in the Big Cypress, the Sunnyland and Raccoon Point, which are the 2 areas where there are oil, had decided to build a pipeline to Port Everglades, which is out near Fort Lauderdale. This allows them to transport the crude quickly and efficiently. However, it failed in 1990 due to corrosion. So now all production coming out of the Big Cypress has to be moved by truck, which creates an enormous logistical problem. And finally, the quality of the oil is low, it's very sour, it's high sulfurous, and it's only really good for bunker fuel. So at a price of $50 a barrel, it's very hard to believe that it's economical to extract what's in the Big Cypress from the oil that they know is there. So the Dan Hughes Company was shut down with a $25,000 fine by the Department of Environmental Protection. What they were doing was called acid well stimulation. They were using hydrochloric or hydrofluoric acid to dissolve the rock, the limestone underneath. They were not hydraulically fracking in the classic sense of the Marcellus or the Bakken Shale. Cracking the rock, they were literally dissolving it, hoping the water would pool, the oil would pool, and the water would pool, and they could pull the oil out. They did it without a permit, and the Department of Environmental Protection shut them down. But this is part of a continuing war on the environment. So my last slide is this. In environmental wars, there is no permanent victory. There's only a temporary truce. And that's my talk, and I thank you all very much for being here.